Hello there.
Hi, Stephen. So nice of you to join me. Thank you.
Hey. Pleasure.
Can you hear
Thanks.
me loud and clearly?
Very good. Where are you physically?
Physically, I'm in the Netherlands,
Ah, okay. I was making a guess from your name. Which part of Netherlands?
Central Park. But yeah,
Okay.
the Netherlands are kind of like the size of Maine, so
Yes.
everything
Yeah.
is rather central.
So that would be let me see, Utrecht.
Exactly.
Ah, nice. Okay. Lucky guess.
Great guess. You've been there?
Yes. I've only driven through a few times. I've been, obviously visiting the art places on the coast, and then sometime in Amsterdam and a conference up in to the north. The name is escaping me right now.
Groningen?
Anyway,
Yeah.
a nice country to drive in. Everything is so organized and precise and clearly signed, and
If we're going to talk Nietzsche and the Nazis, we could sure analyze Calvinism and its related to the Lutheran environment that Nietzsche must have grown up in.
there we are. Oh
Yeah.
my, yeah. Well, you guys were right in the heart of everything back in the day.
Yeah, well, it's very interesting because, of course, the Dutch very closely resemble the Germans, and then again they don't. And what is that difference? And I always tend to joke that the Dutch are just like Germans, but with a sense of humor, and the Germans are without a sense of humor and a tad more, even a tad more obedient and hierarchical.
Yeah. Well, I will let you make those jokes about the Dutch.
Of course. So, and where in the States are you situated?
I'm in Chicagoland,
Oh,
you know,
wow.
from Toronto originally, but I came to the States for my career and have been here ever since.
And I believe Chicago is relatively close to Toronto, right? In North America terms.
Well, I guess about 6 or 7 hours of driving.
Right.
So,
But I guess
yeah.
winter has arrived there.
Yes, but although yeah, we're now into December, but we're doing pretty mildly as far as winter goes. But it will come and have its say.
I guess so. Well,
Yeah. So
I
how should we do this?
I was thinking, well, let me first verbalize a little bit of context why I invited you. Of course, I read your book, Nietzsche and the Nazis.
Hmm.
Um, I'm a great Nietzsche fan, and I've always been also fascinated by his prophecy, his prophetical gift, how he managed to intellectually foresee many developments of the 20th century. And in that
Yes.
light, I thought it would be interesting to discuss uh, that 20th century in relation to his work, his ideas, and the prophecies, and especially the fact, of course, as you discuss in your book, that the Nazis idolized Hitler as kind of like their a mascot philosopher.
Yeah. Yeah.
Whereas I would wonder what I would suspect Nietzsche have a thing or two to say about that, and that is
For sure.
exactly what I would love to hear you shoot at.
Okay, we'll do
So,
that.
what would you think would happen as I briefed you before the start of this interview? If Nietzsche were to return magically to Earth right now and given
Yeah.
time to read up on the history since his death, and
Yes. Yeah,
especially
your questions yeah, set that up very nicely. So we can plunge in. Okay, so mechanically, we should end by about 2 o'clock
right.
at the latest. Does that work for you?
I'm not sure what time it is there, but that
Oh,
would be
I'm
good.
sorry. Yeah, it's about 58 minutes from now.
Yeah, sure, that's fine.
Yeah, I'll have some other appointments to get to on this Thursday afternoon. Okay.
Sure,
All right. So why don't we just turn it over to you and you guide us into the discussion.
exactly. Well, I think that was the main thesis I would like to pose to you for you to shoot at. That if
Yeah.
Nietzsche were to return magically to Earth and would be able to view the world as it is right now and read up on the history of the modern history of Europe and the West since his death, late 19th century. up until now, especially, of course, the 20th century with the advent of Nazism and communism and atheism and decadence and all everything in between.
Mm.
What would he have to say about it? And especially, what would he have to say about the Nazis hijacking him as their mascot?
Okay. All right. So is that the official start, or do you want?
Yes,
I didn't get a recording signal.
I've started recording from the beginning. We
Okay,
used
so we
to
are
introduce
underway.
these recording moments, but then I always found that you have this organic, getting to know each other, and then this
All right,
forced
very
start.
nice.
So
Yeah.
we're into it.
Yeah, so I think that's a great 1 hour question right there, because what we could
Yeah.
do is take each of the 20th century developments that you talk about, and then spend a few minutes talking about what has happened in the 20th century, what Nietzsche predicted about it, and what he perhaps would say if he were in that magic time machine that you were talking about. Now, the interesting thing, though, about me from as a when I wear my philosopher hat, but then more narrowly my history of philosopher hat, now that we can look back on the 20th century from the perspective of early 21st century, is how many different kinds of intellectual movements Nietzsche influenced.
Mm.
So you've got people who are, communist at one end of the spectrum who are claiming inspiration from, and not just inspiration, but influence, right, from Nietzsche. And then many of the postmoderns, right? And at the other end of the spectrum, you have people who are market friendly and capitalists who will be inspired again and claim influence by Nietzsche. Will have people who are theistic in their orientation, Jewish intellectuals, some Christian intellectuals who also say the same thing, as well as atheists. And then philosophically, just to throw another couple of schools out there, the existentialists also are in the mix, as well as those who are hostile critics of existentialism. Then, if we set aside the philosophers for a little bit and just talk about political developments, so then, as you're pointing out, it is a somewhat eye-opening fact that the leading Nazi intellectuals, and by the intellectuals here, I mean serious people with PhDs from very good German universities, then getting university appointments, which are a prize to get in the German academic system. Many of them strongly committed to National Socialist politics, but at the same time, well read in Nietzsche and seeing themselves sometimes as disciples of Nietzsche's, sometimes as taking not necessarily everything that Nietzsche said, but certain important themes from Nietzsche and applying them. And when they apply them, out comes some sort of Nazi philosophy. And then the cousins, the various fascists in Italy, you find the same thing there. The postmoderns, of course, can be more philosophical, but also in their activist orientation when they are explicitly talking about power and entering into the social power dynamic.
Right.
Some of them, like Michel Foucault, will say explicitly, I am a Nietzschean, and he'll say something even stronger. I am simply a Nietzschean, and everything that I am doing is Nietzsche inspired. So our question then is, so with a little bit of hindsight, is what are we to make of these connections? Now, I think that's another way to do it is then to say, well, let's start using some kind of philosophy analytic categories. And we can say Nietzsche was a comprehensive philosopher. That is to say, he had something to say, not necessarily that he worked out all of the arguments in scholarly detail. In some areas he did, but he did at least sketch out a metaphysics, and in his later works, strong metaphysical themes. His views on epistemology, again, in his later works, worked out to some high degree of specificity. He has a view of human nature. He has a value theory. He talks a lot about social philosophy. He does comment in an informed way about the major philosophers who preceded him in all of these areas. So even if we just take him as a straight philosophy, I think there is a reconstruction that can be done to say this is what a Nietzschean system, right, or a Nietzschean sketch, an overview of a philosophy would look like, and pretty much all of the major issues would be addressed. We would have a explicit text backing up this is Nietzsche's position on this particular issue. So if we are interested in the philosophical schools, some of them are drawing on his metaphysics more. So for example, when Michel Foucault says, I'm a Nietzschean, I think primarily what he means is he's very struck with Nietzsche's reduction of everything to power and to will to power, and that is the kind of the ontological bottom line or the substrate out of which everything emerges. So he is taking the Nietzschean metaphysics. When many of the skeptics will, and later relativists of the 20th century, will say that they are Nietzschean, I think in many cases what they are doing is hearkening back to Nietzsche's perspectivalism, where he argues, strongly against any objective understanding of human cognition. It's not that our senses put us in contact with reality, or that our concepts are abstracts from reality, or that logic is reflective in any way of a structure out there in reality. Rather, he's quite explicitly saying everything is a subjective imposition on reality, and then that means that we end up each with our own perspectives, and certain kinds of subjectivity and relativism come out of that. So there is that. All of the philosophers who want to say that we need to, in the 20th century, abandon any notion of universal principles, universal rights, like the Enlightenment philosophers, we have the right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, that human beings in some fundamental way should be treated as morally equal. Again, another kind of universalistic claim. Those who reject those claims can find very strong support in Nietzsche as well. So that would then be to approach it more analytically. And then we find various philosophers who then in their social philosophy would then be drawing out the implications of that. And I think individuals like Carl Schmitt in the German context, who was a Nazi, Martin Heidegger, who was a philosopher in the German context, and again, a Nazi, they would be working that territory as well. So that's just to come at it from the philosophy perspective. Perhaps the more shocking part would be to start not only with the intellectuals, but to look at the party activists and the party politicians. So then we start talking about people like Goebbels, Joseph Goebbels, Adolf Hitler himself, and all of them, again, were explicitly admiring of Friedrich Nietzsche, and gifting Nietzsche's works to visiting dignitaries and quoting Nietzsche in speeches, and all of that's the kind of shocking evidence. And then the question could then be, since these are not necessarily intellectuals in a public intellectual sense, they are politicians. Are we going to hold them to the same standard of rigor, or are we going to apply a different standard? But nonetheless, what do we make of their claiming that they are Nietzschean? So let me kick it back to you to see where you would like to drill down to from there.
Exactly. It's a great context. I think even if the politicians, if we were to hold them to a different standard than professional academics or intellectuals, I think that makes the question even more interesting from a psychological standpoint. If they're mere admirers or, let's say, intellectual visitors of that work, what then exactly happens when they ignore those parts where Nietzsche is a vocal anti-Semite? And even, I believe I remember reading once in one of his works that he advocated some kind of like eugenics project to take the highest Jewish families and mix them with the highest aristocrats and business families of Europe to make some kind of super synergy between both. We're would that be a simple case of that their admiration for like the Spartan Darwinistic way of looking at things toppled the anti-Semitism bit? What do you think?
Yeah. Yeah, let's come back to the anti-Semitism in particular, and to take the first half of your comment about the standard by which we're going to hold politicians to. And I think the historical analogies that would be worth thinking about would be thinking of, say, the American revolutionaries. So people like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and George Washington and the others. And what's interesting is how many of those would say that they are followers of John Locke. And so, and that's a thinker who's 3 generations earlier, say. But nonetheless, they all read Locke and they all saw themselves as believers in Lockean philosophy and applying it to this new country that they are trying to build. Another analogy then would be in the French Revolution. By the time we get to what I think of as the third phase, when the Jacobins take over, so Maximilien Robespierre and Marat and Saint-Just and the others. And all of them explicitly say, we are disciples of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Now, that's only a 1 generation gap, and they are activist politicians. What standard do we apply there? Or in the case, say, of Karl Marx, what do we say about Lenin, Stalin, Trotsky, Mao Zedong, and others, all of whom think of themselves as true believers in Marxist philosophy and applying it in a political revolutionary context. Another interesting one I've spent some time with is in politicized Islam, what we sometimes call Islamism. So people like Osama bin Laden and various others. And when you look, you can see that there's a connection to the Egyptian philosopher, theologian Sayyid Qutb. And in many cases, they will say, we are disciples of Sayyid Qutb, who had been killed by the Egyptian authorities, I think, in the 1960s. But then again, a generation later, his disciples, at least according to them, are explicitly doing so. So then I think we have to then start getting to specifics. And clearly, in any time you're doing political activism, you're going to be talking about 50 or 70 or 100 issues and policies that you're trying to put in place. So then to say, what would the philosopher in question have to say about all 70 of those things? That would be a very big project to say. So I think the shorter cut is to say that the political philosophy that's going to lead to particular policy applications, that's the place to look for the intersection. So what we might then say is, in the case of Nietzsche, at a high philosophical level, Nietzsche is very much not a liberal, shall we say. So he doesn't believe that individuals have rights. He doesn't believe that people should be free as a general principle, that what we should do is make things and trade with each other like free market capitalists. All of that liberalism from the Enlightenment on into the 19th century and on into the 20th century, Nietzsche is rejecting all of that. And so at that level of principle, what he's arguing is that individuals are not really free and traders, but rather they are in the grip of power, and our social relationships are fundamentally adversarial, strong versus weak, master versus slave power relationships. So we have liberalism as a political philosophy and then Nietzscheanism as a political philosophy. So I think the next step then is to say that's still a fairly general principle, to believe that individuals are in power relations, those power relations are adversarial, and so life is about a conflict, struggle between strong and weak, and one should enter into that on behalf of the strong and try to advance their interests. If we just stop right there, I think that level of political philosophy analysis leaves open the door still to quite a few different practical politics outcomes, because then you would have to ask, well, who are the strong and who are the weak in your estimation? And we can see different people saying, I agree with Nietzsche generally, but nonetheless disagreeing with each other about, in their generation, who are the strong party and who are the weak party that should be gotten rid of. So just to take one example, atheists could come along and say, well, we are the strong because psychologically we don't need to believe in this God figure, this daddy, this who's going to look after us and protect us from the bad guys. We're able to face the world without those illusions and go forth and do our political activism as atheists. And so some sort of existentialist in this way might pat himself on the back, say religion is an old crutch and we are the strong, and people who are religious are the weak ones. And so what we, as a matter of our political philosophy, can do is get rid of the weak ones, and that means attacking religion and getting rid of religion. So for that approach to political philosophy, it would be atheists versus theists. That's the important point. Now, in the case of Nazis, right, they would then say, well, we don't necessarily think so. We think the divide is different. And we could say, for example, that what we need is some sort of a religion, maybe a modernized, more state, political friendly religion. We're not going to be liberals and try to separate church and state. Instead, we're going to see religion as one of the tools of power that the state will use. And then our question is going to be, what do we think is the strongest religion and what do we think is the weak religion? And so then they might say, well, we think some sort of Christianity is the right kind of religion, and we think Judaism is the wrong kind of religion. And so then you would have people saying, we are in favor of Nietzschean political philosophies, but taking it in a different direction. Others might take it in a racial direction. They might say it's strong versus weak power politics, but divide the line racially. And it's this race versus that race, and we are a member of this race, and we think it's the superior race, and various other races are inferior races. And I think all of those would have a claim, a legitimate claim, to saying they are Nietzschean at a general philosophical level.
So that's very interesting, multidimensional, and I think I can follow you at every step. I, in more plainer terms, wonder whether the Nazis completely missed the mark reading Nietzsche. As I would say, when I read Nietzsche, of course, there's a lot of critique of, like, let's say, Judaism and the origin story of the Jews, the Exodus story.
Yeah, yes.
In their first being one of the first ethnicities to install slave morality. But I believe I'm correct if I say that when Nietzsche talks about Christians and Jews, he kind of means the same slave morality, the same theological construct that originates in the Hebrews through the Israelites and then through the Christians, Catholics, Protestants all over the world and over Europe.
Yes. So that raises, then, I think, if I could just jump in, a very interesting question, because in the official Nazi Party program from 1920, and Hitler was one of the authors and an early leader of the party program. It is a 25-point program, but there is a positive endorsement of Christianity in the official program. So I think your analysis is right. I think that for Nietzsche, if we go then back to him, he thinks that Judaism is the first slave morality. And then out of that, centuries later, Christianity emerges. But it emerges as a purification, and so to speak, within the dynamic of Judaism, an improvement over that slave morality. So from that perspective,
a new covenant, an inversion of the old covenant and an improved upon new covenant kind of.
Yes. So in that case, Nietzsche's view is that Christianity is worse than Judaism.
Right.
So he would be anti-Judaism and anti-Christian, but a little more anti-Christian than he is anti-Jew. So then that would be then an important deviation from his perspective by the Nazis if they want to say, no, no, we are anti-Jew, but we're endorsing some form of Christianity. And so that would be something that Nietzsche would be critical of them.
Exactly, and that's exactly my point in the missing the mark bit. I think the Nazis, what they invoke in me as a Dutch person living next to Germany or being familiar with the Germanic and Latin cultures around me, is that there is this typical Germanic provincialism, so to speak. It exists here, it exists in Belgium, it exists in England and in Germany. And of course, there is this stereotypical association with like this Schlager racism that sometimes tends to pop up or that tends to be associated with it. And it's exactly the kind of aspect I want to emphasize right now. Not so much the racism, but especially the provincialism. I think the Nazis with their tendency toward, so for example, a racial explanation. I think that is a petty Germanic, racist, but especially provincial way to regard these things. Whereas if I read Nietzsche, I think if we were to define an unter or an übermensch, and if we were to do it, even if we were to do it ethnically or racially, I think the Jews would be very great candidates for more like a Superman position with their overrepresentation in their Pulitzer Prizes in art and science. There might not have been many Jewish Alexander the Greats, but there have been a lot of Jewish intellectual and Alexander the Greats in modern times. So their failure to capture the essence of what Nietzsche called rèssentiment, I think it makes it all a big fat joke. But I'm not sure if you follow.
Yeah. So then if we focus on Judaism in particular, I think that's a very interesting point to raise because you are talking Nobel Prizes, and that's a 21st century phenomenon. And Nietzsche would not have been aware of it, but he did on several points in his writings praise the Jews for being smarter than pretty much everyone else, cleverer, and he basically says if the Jews wanted to take over Europe, they could, right? Partly because he thinks many of the other racial groups, ethnic groups, religious groups, and so on are so weak and pathetic. So there's an interesting question then, because Nietzsche is then praising the Jews of his time. I think there's still some low-grade anti-Semitism in Nietzsche, but it's pretty low grade compared to pretty much everyone else of his generation. And it is mixed in with this strong praise and recognition of the legitimate accomplishments of Jews of his time. And then we have to ask the question, well, how did the Jews accomplish this? Is there something special about their religion? Is there something special about them ethnically? Is there something special about them racially? Is it biological? Is it ideological? Is it cultural? And whatever it is. And then for him, the very big question would be how this is possible given his slave morality analysis. That if we go back however many centuries to the Exodus and the lead up to the Exodus story, the story that Nietzsche is telling there is purely a cultural analysis, right? So the Jews were just like any number of other groups there, but culturally they happened to be in a situation of slavery. They were enslaved. And so it's not anything internal to their ideology at that point, and it's not anything about them biologically at that point. It is purely a social circumstancing that is conditioning them to generate a certain code of values, the slave values. So that then is to say, when Nietzsche is opposed to Judaism, he is opposed to that cultural response to actual existential circumstances.
Right.
Right. So he's not got anything against them racially. And if they had just been another minority religion kicking around in the Mediterranean basin like hundreds of other ones that had never amounted to very much, then he would have nothing special to say, I think, about them ideologically either. So then the question is going to be, by the time we get to the 19th century and on into the 20th century, and people are starting to talk more racially, and to try to make race into a more biological phenomenon. Where does Nietzsche stand in that particular mix? Because what it does seem to be is that he is nonetheless all the time using, or rather not all the time, but most of the time using highly biological metaphors. So
Right.
he, all of his analogies are to the animal kingdom, and there are the predator species and there are the prey species. So there are the lions and there are the sheep, there are the eagles and there are the little rabbits and so forth. And so it's all predator and prey. And he does have this quasi-evolutionary account of how power develops that can be mapped onto a kind of Darwinian survival of the fittest. So the first hypothesis then would be that Nietzsche is saying, in his view, it really is some sort of more biological power analysis that has to be articulated as fundamental, and that what happens culturally is then secondary or derivative. And then I think this is the thing that then sets up for the question of the Nazis, if they are saying, well, we're not just opposed to the Jews, say, on religious grounds. So this is not just old-fashioned, Christian and Muslim anti-Jewism because we think they killed Jesus or they're not following Allah or whatever. So it's not just religious anti-Semitism. If the Nazis are saying that there are biological differences between the races and that the Jews biologically are in the inferior race, is it fair then to say that they can get some support from from Nietzsche rather? Because Nietzsche is precisely saying, after Charles Darwin, we need to think biologically and think in terms of instincts that are conditioned in the power struggle over the generation, the ones that survive and the ones that get incorporated in. So again, is Nietzsche at a very general level articulating a set of biological racial categories that the Nazis can come along and then say, well, we're just applying them in this particular way. And so there is a legitimate connection there.
But wouldn't you say that, of course, Nietzsche is closer to Darwin and is earlier in time? Wouldn't you say that what Nietzsche meant there was more a biological Darwinian outlook, but more in a
Yes.
universal sense, applying to all ethnicities and races, applying to the divide between within every human or within every human community? For example,
Yes.
we did also laud and praise Islam for being a more strong and heroic and masculine
Yeah.
religion. But of course, also at that time, Muslims are just as much a Semitic population as Jewish people ethnically or
Right.
historically. So what is the connection there?
So then I think to follow up on that, then I think we would add some sort of life cycles analysis. So Nietzsche does say, for example, the Greeks under Alexander rose up and became a master race, but then they declined. The same thing of the Romans, the same thing of the Arabs, the same thing with respect to the samurai in Japan, the same thing with respect to the Vikings out of the north. And he does say even the Germans in the Middle Ages, they got their act together. So this still could be a biological analysis. So just as individuals, they have their youth and then they come to their fullness of power, but then they go into decline. We could say races go in that same that same cycle. And here a connection would be from Nietzsche to someone like Oswald Spengler in the next generation. So where Spengler sees himself as largely a Nietzschean, and when he writes in The Decline of the West, it's a very Darwinian, Nietzschean analysis, but he wants to argue that the entire West has kind of gotten its biological power act together and done something significant, but now it's in a decline phase, and there's nothing that we can do about it. So then the Nazis would then just be in the next generation. And many of the leading Nazis, after Spengler became so famous and so popular, saw themselves as very close to Spengler, except more optimistic. They were wanting to say, yes, you're right about Nietzsche and Darwin, but it's not the case that all is lost for the West. If we Germans racially can get our act together, we should be able to get out of what seems like a temporary decline phase. Yes, we lost World War I. Okay, that was a big blow, but don't see that as a sign of terminal decline. That just see that as one lost major battle in an overall battle. So again, still just a hypothesis whether the Nazi intellectuals can legitimately say, well, we're just doing Darwin to Nietzsche to Spengler, but a more optimistic Spengler. That's us in the 20s and the 1930s.
All right, that's an interesting take. Maybe it is my instinct to exalt Nietzsche in a way because of admiration, to want to spare him from the projected racism as I interpret it. Maybe that's a tad too naive. But then on the other hand, if you take someone elderly out for a drive and they make some odd some cringe remark, some politically incorrect racist remark, can you hold them to the same standard of account that you could someone from a different generation?
Yeah. Now, another issue, because another part of what you said that was interesting was then to say maybe the right level of analysis, though, is not racial groups as a whole. So we would say the Greeks, the Romans, the Arabs, the samurai, Japanese, right, and so on. Maybe the right analysis is, and then you said within species. So it's not that some races are more master predatory and other races are weak and slave-like, but that within every race there are individuals who are more master-like and more slave-like within that group. So then what we would say is perhaps the analysis would be of the Germans in the early part of the 20th century. If they see themselves as Nietzschean, they'll say, yes, this is the German population as a whole, but we've got within our group some Germans who are weaker, and we need to get rid of them or marginalize them in some way. But our analysis might be that the reason why those people in our mix are weaker is because they have been mixed in with other races. They came, they're not the pure German type through various breeding programs. Rather, they are the result of interbreeding. And so what we need to do is stop the interbreeding in order to purify the race. And there is a long history of that in German thinking, and not only in German thinking, but very pronouncedly in German thinking, starting in the 1800s. And it's part and parcel of the rise of racial analyses, the rise of ethnic analyses, and certain kinds of nationalism. Again, we're not going to be liberal, they would say. We're not going to say we're going to be free traders and cosmopolitans and turn the world into one giant liberal marketplace and we're all citizens of the world. Rather, that's what makes people weak. That's what makes cultures weak, is trying to mix Spanish with French and French with German and so forth. What we need to do is keep each of the ethnicities racially pure, and they are pushing a biological line. Now, also to come back to part of what you were saying is, if we go to Nietzsche, then particular, Nietzsche, when he was younger, did seem to be more nationalistic. He was praising things German and had nasty negative things to say about the French and about the English and various other national groups. But on my reading of him, as he gets into his middle phase and later, he stops talking at that level and he starts talking about cultivating Europeanness, right?
Right.
So it's not like a liberal global cosmopolitan, I can be a citizen of the world and live anywhere and we're all going to mix. But he does seem to have this pan-European vision. And it's not just German, it's not just Polish, it's not just Scandinavian. It is something more general. So to the extent that the right reading of Nietzsche is to see him as advocating a kind of European progress, right, against perhaps other parts of the world, then the Germans, by emphasizing the nationalism and tearing Europe apart, that would be anti-Nietzschean.
Right. I think a realistic read would be that, of course, Nietzsche was part of a culture that was thinking in these themes that were becoming very fashionable at that time. In a time where people generally were more nationalistic, maybe even more tribal. We could even argue in some respects a little bit more differently informed, primitive than we are. So I think realistically, we cannot argue that he was aracial or that he didn't think in racial terms, because he obviously did. However, I just don't get the feeling that his emphasis within his work is on the competition between these obvious racial competitive groups, but rather a playful thinking about indeed a pan-Europeanism in which we could easily mix the stronger elements of such and such, which brought me to that initial response that I thought rather he is talking about indeed some kind of a biological outlook, Darwinian outlook on these matters.
Yes, I think that's the right way to go. Just because because Nietzsche, in many cases, the great heroes he emphasizes are military people, people like Alexander and Julius Caesar and Napoleon and so on. So we could come back to the question of where he would place someone like Adolf Hitler in that pantheon of trying to be a great. But Nietzsche also was a great admirer of other elements of culture. Literary achievements and artistic achievements and musical achievements, not so much scientific achievements and business achievements, interestingly, but to the extent that he admired what was going on in the musical world, he recognized that it wasn't like only Germans, right? It was also Austrians and some Italians and so forth. And in the artistic world, in the literary world, there are great English writers and great French writers, and again, great German writers as well. So I think all of that would push him in a more pan-European direction. At that point, writing in the late part of the 1800s, there's not a huge amount significant happening culturally in North America. So he's not going to see there. He's not going to see much happening in Africa or South America or Asia. So maybe it is reflecting on the actual wide-ranging nationally accomplishments in all sorts of spheres that's going to push him in a more pan-European direction. So somehow we need to and he does at one, this is just one remark I remember, he does say that he thinks marriage should not be a private individual thing. He does think it should be arranged by the state for breeding purposes. So clearly some sort of early eugenics is going to be on his mind. So the idea, I guess, would be if we could find, you get Beethoven together with the right woman who also has shown great, maybe Clara Schumann or something like that. That's how we're going to breed the right kind of musicians and
Exactly.
so forth.
Very curious what kind of composer that would bring us.
Yeah.
Before we started, I was trying to organize my thoughts, and I made this little with my marker. I made this little scheme, and I would like to present it to you on my note block.
Ah, nice. Okay.
Sure, if you can see it proper.
All right. So
hear myself. Okay. So
all right.
I made this little scheme. Generally, people tend to think about this alleged dichotomy between fascism and communism. I have placed a big fat red X across there because I think it's a false dichotomy. Because
okay, so the arrow means a dichotomy or an equivalence?
Uh, Sorry, I mean false equivalence. Thank you, indeed. Yeah.
Okay, all right, yeah,
No,
because it looks like they're more interchangeable, right? When you're saying
right.
not, okay,
Oh, I do say. I think they are to a large extent interchangeable or similar.
yes,
Then I proceed to this comparison because I think fascism, the only difference I think between fascism and communism, generally speaking, and then
mm,
I'm actually talking about Nazism here because I actually think people tend to mistake National Socialism for the fascism we know from, for example, Mussolini or other instances.
okay, okay. So you're talking here fascism, not National Socialism.
I'm trying to capture the standard way of thinking that most people, for example, when they try to interpret current day polarization, for example, in the United States, but also here in Europe,
Okay,
between left and right, they tend to think that the extremes or the two polarities are fascism, as like a
oh, I see.
layman, folkish term, fascism on the one hand, communism on the other hand.
Mm,
And I argue, my personal conviction is that the only difference between the swastika and the hammer and sickle in general, very much generalized, is that the one, Nazism or fascism, is hierarchophilic, and the communist equivalent is hierarchophobic in
yeah,
nature or in outlook.
all
But
right,
that the one is national socialist, the other one is international socialist. The
okay,
one is racist socialist or
okay,
ethnocentric socialist. The other is internationalist but hermetic socialist.
okay,
And then I made up these two buckets.
okay.
I've been busy.
Utopian collectivism.
Exactly. I think they belong in the same bucket. Oh, sorry, the same bucket, which is utopian collectivism.
Mm-hmm.
And then I suspect, and that is where my question leads, my final analysis I want you to shoot at. Is this what Nietzsche would have agreed with? That these two nihilist, utopian, collectivist, socialist,
Yeah.
psychopathic, totalitarian excesses
Yes.
belong equally in this basket, whereas individuality, aristocracy, and with a question mark behind it, liberalism, might
Question
be
there.
the
Yes.
opposing
Yes.
one. I think you already answered the liberalism question. I don't think Nietzsche was big of a fan. And conclusively, that I think that only a slave or someone operating from slave morality would want collectivism, because a
Yes.
true master, a true aristocrat, has no need of collectivism.
Yes. Yes. No, I think that's very very thoughtful. I think the in your what was for me on the right hand bucket, the things
Right,
that Nietzsche would endorse, it's pretty clear that he's not a liberal,
right,
and uh, and partly that's not just political liberalism; it's also a more philosophical anti-liberalism. He doesn't think that we have free will or that in any way we are free. It really is power at the substrate level manifests itself in a quite biologically deterministic fashion.
hmm,
So we are just a more complicated animal. So, for his perspective, it doesn't make sense to say that rabbits have freedom, or trees have freedom, or even eagles have freedom. Instead, it's a biologically reductionist story all the way down. So, all these liberal ideas that we should be responsible for ourselves and we praise people as good and blame them as bad. Nietzsche typically sets aside more moralistic language and replaces it with, again, biological language. So they're just healthy individuals and unhealthy individuals, biologically and psychologically. But I think the aristocracy point is right, and Nietzsche, he does explicitly say, "I am not liberal in any way," but he does explicitly say that he is promoting a new kind of aristocracy of some sort, and it might be a pan-European aristocracy. And here he thinks an inequality of rights is mandatory. And so he does think some people are better than others, stronger than others, healthier than others, more creative than others, and other people are repulsive and it's from his perspective shameful that we have to say that they're part of the human species. You just want to say they are
yeah,
there's something out there. So he thinks only those special individuals really have any moral worth, social worth, and so therefore should have any political worth. And so resources and power should be concentrated on them, and that does take you in into some kind of aristocracy. In my view, I don't think it's any particular kind of aristocracy, and I think actually Nietzsche doesn't, when you push him, really worry about whether formally we have a democratic or a republican or a socialist or any kind of political system, because I think in his view, he wants to say the people who are really the master types, the smart, clever, creative ones, whatever the system is, they will find a way to find the levers of power in that system and use them on their behalf. So it might be that formally we're in a democracy, and so there will be politicians nonetheless who they will be dictators in the democracy, but they will just learn to use democratic sounding words in a way that keeps the population voting for them and gives them the right number of goodies and freebies to keep them happy, all the while that politician is just doing what he wants to do anyway. So I don't think he is in favor of aristocracy, but that doesn't mean that there has to be some legal constitution that assigns political rights and so on. I think he thinks that's going to happen anyway. I do have a question though about in your bucket. In addition to the liberalism and the aristocracy, you had individualism, and this is a very interesting one
I have to correct you because I think it's a small but important detail. I said individuality.
Oh, individuality. Ah, very good. Okay,
Because
nice.
At first my reflex was to write individualism, but I noticed at the end like that's not
Okay,
really what he means.
okay. No, and I think that's a movement in the right direction, because I think if you want to say that he is an individualist or believes in individualism, that's going to mean a whole set of principles. And many of those principles Nietzsche is going to reject. So he's going to say,
Because they
for
lead to liberalism.
yeah, that's right. The vast majority of people, I don't think, they are individuals. I don't think they have any worth. So I'm not going to say, those individuals should be able to do whatever they want in their lives. And it is interesting when you get down into his metaphysics of human nature, what he thinks of humans. He does at various points say he doesn't think individuals really exist. So I might think that I have these thoughts and my own ideas and values and goals, and those are the things that make me the unique individual that I am. But he does see those merely as manifestations of underlying instinctual will to power drives coming out, and that individuality doesn't really work at that metaphysical level. So with your move to individuality, I think he would say yes, that the individuals who are creative, strong, healthy, assertive, able to generate new values and commit themselves to bringing those values forth, those are going to be individuals. And they will, almost all of them, have a self-reflective awareness that they are special. And they will, as part of their self-reflectiveness, not accept any of the other doctrines that tell them you are not special, right? You get one vote, everybody else gets one vote, right? Or everybody is equal, or that you should serve everybody, serve the collective, right? Or that you should share all of your resources with everybody else. So their individuality will rebel at a very fundamental against any of that. And so whatever their values are, they will assert those as individuals. So it will be rare, special, unique individuals who are the new creators of whatever values they commit to.
Which sounds like quite a universalist outlook on the possibility of the Superman, the man.
What do you mean by universalist in that context?
Universalist as it could apply to any people in any given time.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, that's sort of when you look at the various examples, he wants to say, Alexander was a Greek, right? And so he just came out of, and then you have Alexander, and then all of the samurai, and then the various Arabs and the Vikings. So I think right now we can't predict where the next, self-assertive individual who has all of his power centers concentrated and directed toward creating new values. It could be someone from Bolivia or Singapore or anywhere, as far as we know. So there's not going to be anything special about Europe. Although I do want to say that my sense is that Nietzsche does have some sort of dynamic between biology and culture, so that that does take certain special individuals to take the culture in a certain direction. And then the culture will then make possible more individuals in the next generation that have potential to go up one level further. So there has to be some sort of interplay there. And I think from his late 19th century perspective, he would say Europe is, if you are a gambler, Europe is the place to place your bets at that point.
He kind of believes like in this possibility for a people to breed itself or to domesticate itself.
Yes.
As opposed to slave master paradigms.
So the interesting thing would be, what would Nietzsche be surprised then at what happens, say, in the United States? So here we are in the early 21st century, and if we're writing the story of the 20th century, certainly developments in the United States of America are going to be a big part of that, right? So, but as far as I can tell, the United States was just not at all in Nietzsche's consciousness in the late 1800s. There's a few passing mentions here and there. So would he be surprised that the so-called Superman or many of the great creators were across the Atlantic Ocean in the next generation? And then by contrast, would we be surprised a century from now, supposing we're still around, because we take our vitamins and all that life extension stuff? If the next person comes out of Asia or sub-Saharan Africa, that's where all the great developments are.
Exactly. Well, finally, I was curious if we make the link back to Adolf Hitler, because it's such a fun and light subject. Now, Hitler, of course, I believe also in Mein Kampf stated nature to be aristocratic, which of course is directly a Nietzschean phrasing.
Yes.
However, Hitler, of course, himself was considered to be a vulgar provincial weirdo in his decades of trying to come up, and only later was endorsed by German aristocracy out of perhaps fear or lack of better options for them to
political necessity. Yes. Yeah.
And was vehemently anti-Semitic towards what he considered the world dominating Jews, so to speak. So did Adolf Hitler actually have a aristocracy complex towards the Jews and the real aristocrats of Germany and Europe?
Yeah. So I think there's two questions there. What would
from a ressentiment perspective?
Yes.
What was eventful in a way towards himself, not to have been born a true Ludendorff or whatever, and was he angry with the Jews for producing the Einsteins and the Wittgensteins and all the real aristocratic thinkers and painters and philosophers of the time?
Right. So your question then is, would Nietzsche present that sort of analysis using his rèssentiment concept and applying it to Hitler?
Right.
Yes. I think that's at least half correct. And I think, obviously Hitler is a complicated figure. And I think at one level, you would have to say that Nietzsche would be open to saying that Hitler is almost in the line of the great conquerors, from Alexander to Julius Caesar to Napoleon and perhaps to Hitler. And we don't say, well, we cross Napoleon off the list because ultimately he failed. And we wouldn't necessarily just cross Hitler off the list because ultimately he failed. Part of what Nietzsche would be responding to just was the the sheer ambition of these individuals, wherever they come from. So Napoleon came from a petty aristocratic family that was just kind of barely in and had no money, but he was from Corsica.
Yeah.
But somehow he came to be at the top of the establishment. We might say the same thing about Alexander the Great. Philip, his father, was the king, but not a particularly impressive or powerful king. There's lots of other ones in the area, but Alexander had something special. Julius had something special. Napoleon had something special. And clearly, Adolf Hitler had something special that did enable him to get to the top of a nation like Germany. And arguably, Germany was the most culturally advanced, one of the most economically advanced, and clearly, perhaps the biggest single military in the world at the time, until the Americans got their act together. And he was able to wield it for his own personal ambitions. So there has to be a positive Nietzschean estimation of Hitler to some level.
Exactly. But on the other hand, Napoleon.
Then on the other hand, yes, exactly right.
Napoleon,
So
they did not operate from grievance. Would Nietzsche agree with that? And Hitler.
Well, here, yeah, that I don't know. I know part of the Macedonian circumstance at the time was to have a bit of a complex with respect to Athens, with respect to Sparta. That those were the great glory Greek civilizations, and we are semi-barbarian up here in the north. We could also try to do the same thing with respect to Napoleon, right? We're Corsican, and we just have these Corsican grievances. The French don't take us seriously. So there are psychoanalytical interpretations of all of these guys. But I do think, with respect to the Jews, that yes, there has to be a rèssentiment analysis. So that I think Nietzschean psychology is going to work with Hitler. And the thing that is the standout event in my thinking is when you get to the middle part of the war, when Germany is now fighting the battle on two fronts. It's fighting the Western battle and it's fighting an Eastern battle. And it is stretched thin. It had miscalculated. It was hoping that the US would stay out of the war, but now the Americans have joined the war, and that's really bad news for the Germans. And the Japanese are struggling on the Western front and not able to provide as much support against the Soviets and the Russians as they had hoped. So huge miscalculations, and every resource is needed to ensure the success of the war, or even the survival of the war for the Germans. And so at that point, you would think a realistic question would be to say, yes, we Nazis, if we are Nazis, we don't like the Jews, and we want to get rid of the Jews, and we want to exterminate the Jews if we can, but that's going to take huge amount of resources, right? All of this manpower, all of these rail lines, all of these, just a huge amount of resources to try to exterminate Jews. And then to say, what is the more important issue that we are facing now in 1943? Fighting this war or killing the Jews on a larger scale? And what Hitler decided for, killing Jews, is more important, even though obviously that is going to make it a strong likelihood that you're going to lose the war. So I think that indicates that there is something psychological at work, some sort of obsession that can only be captured in the pathological, psychological terms. And I don't think a Nietzschean analysis is going to be the whole story, but Nietzsche's concept of rèssentiment is going to be a big part of that story.
I think he will twist his big mustache and at least murmur rèssentiment.
Yes.
Thank you so much. This is a beautiful conclusion. Sorry
Okay,
for
very good.
a little bit.
Yeah, real pleasure. Thoughtful questions and interesting hypotheses you're floating. So yeah, thanks for hosting, and I'll look forward to seeing it published.
Thank you so much. I will share when it's you. Thank you, Stephen.
Great.
Bye-bye.
Bye for now, Dirk.
Bye.